wanted to talk today a little bit about ancient economic thought, and we begin with the very famous Solon. He, of course, had one name, much like Prince. He was the architect of very early theory about economics and politics in the ancient world. We usually think of the ancient world as ancient Greece, beginning around 750 BCE and then followed up by Rome with the founding of the Roman Republic in around 500 BCE and running through Constantine in the 4th century after the turn of the centuries. Economic analysis is still an anachronistic concept, much like it was with tribal societies, although there was much economic activity of varying kinds through these 1500 years. The first well-documented economic thinking from this period occurs with Solon, who wrote a new constitution for Athens around 600 BCE. Again, as I said earlier, this was probably the first real political economic thought that may well have been one of the earliest formal statements of political economic organization that we have. The key action of Solon was something we call the seisoktheia, which is the Greek version of the phrase shaking off of burdens. The new constitution that he developed for Athens freed many of the slaves, essentially the Athenian citizens who had fallen into slavery. He made enslavement for debt illegal, canceled most of the existing debts, provided incentives to bring foreign craftsmen to Athens and to train local citizens in crafts, and he produced a standard silver currency to facilitate Mediterranean trade. These are important changes in the way life was continuing in ancient Greece. Now, the interesting thing about this constitution is that it divided the populace into 4 categories based on property criteria, which is a very common thing historically about how voting rights have been allocated. Each class could elect its own representative, but all of the representatives had to be members of the wealthiest class, even if they represented the poor classes. The ideas of the Solonic Constitution are really just pragmatic policy responses to the problems facing Athens, rather than a consistent or a class-based or a scientific policy based on clear economic analysis. Nevertheless, it tells us a lot about how that society was organized. So these are the 4 categories of property classes that you may want to study a bit more. The first one is the Pentakosio Medimnoi, which are the richer people. They actually had about 500 or more medimnoi of grain or metrare of oil and wine. A medimnoi is about a little under 2 bushels, so you get an idea that it wasn't that huge, but it was still quite substantial. The hippeis is the second largest class, or the second richest class, and these individuals also owned land and were able to produce several hundred medimnoi or metrare of oil and wine. And the hippeis actually is sort of slid over to include a kind of cavalry reference. Hippeis obviously has something to do with horses, and the hippeis class often owned horses and were involved with the cavalry. The Zeugitai were again doing all right. They worked on their own land for a livelihood, and but only produced about 200 of these measures of grain or oil and wine. And finally, there were the Thetes, which were the tenant farmers or agricultural laborers, the poor people, in other words. So each of these 4 classes had a representative in the city council, and we'll be playing with that in class when we talk about the debates within the city council among the various classes. Now, the Zeugitai were actually an endangered species due to the loss of land and personal freedom through bad crops. How exactly did they lose their personal freedom? We can think of it as a situation where they lost land by pledging it as security for loans they couldn't repay, but then they end up giving up their land, and so they have to figure out some other way to to secure their loan of working capital for the next year. And so finally they end up falling into slavery because they put their own person up as security for loans. And so the Zugitai were becoming more and more thieves and slaves, and that essentially undermined the middle class, you might say. So Solon was brought in by the government of Athens to try to deal with this instability that was developing in the society. And so Solon, as they say, pulled up the boundary stones and restored the hektimeroi to Zugitai status. The Seisachthea also allowed those who had fled from slavery and debt to return, and they banned future security, pledging yourself as security for a loan. The Thetes, of course, were still there, and they had no land, and they were essentially day laborers, and so we ended up with a continuation of classes, but at least with the reforms of Solon, we reduced the instability in the ancient society. Now, some of the other writers that came forward, Plato, Xenophon, Aristotle, and Cicero, they all had a little bit more explicit economic thinking in their writings, unlike Solon. And there were some modest analytical aspects in some of their writings. But as I said earlier, the ancient world was not especially interested in uncovering the laws of motion of a society. A society was, in their view, static and permanent, very hierarchical and permanently so. Now, they didn't really care about that kind of investigation. How could a system be operating independent of human will? A capitalist system, for example, has a certain set of tendencies that go on. Now, obviously, people can intervene and affect how it works, but there's a certain functioning of that system that we model. They didn't care about that. They were interested in wealth and luxury, of course, and the power that goes with it, but they weren't really interested in understanding a system, a social system. Actually, the same thread runs through medieval thinking and even into early capitalist thinking. But one of the reasons that you don't need to get into a modeling or an analytical approach is that in these exploitative societies with slavery and serfdom, everything is pretty obvious. There's the slaves who are producing, and you take it. The serfs are producing, and you take it. It's not a whole lot of hidden processes in these systems, but in a capitalist system, for example, it appears as if there's justice, and yet we have vast inequalities. How does that happen? Why does that happen? There are sort of hidden processes within the capitalist system that require a more analytical approach. In short, slavery was considered natural in these societies. As Aristotle said, some men are born to be masters and some men are born to be slaves. The lack of emphasis on scientific analysis continued even into the later periods. Even Francis Hutcheson, who was Adam Smith's mentor, found little place for economics per se in his work on A Short Introduction to Moral Philosophy, even though in the third part of that work, The Principles of Economics and Politics, you would think you would find something there, but instead it was more of a moralistic kind of statement about marriage, divorce, and responsibilities of the various household members. There is some useful business-related analysis about property, inheritance, and contracts in the second part of that work, but even these pragmatic topics were not considered part of real economics by this influential philosopher. Next time we're going to take a look, and this is a little preview, of Xenophon, Aristotle, and household management, where we actually begin to have a taste of economic analysis. Thank you for listening to this video clip.